right, so it was a historic day in Atlanta talking about voting rights, an issue that is not going away. Also bringing about a rare hearing that we haven't seen in about 20 years. Francesca, tell us why people are not letting up on this. This is a huge deal.
It's a very big deal, Aisha. Democrat members of the Senate Rules Committee were in Atlanta all yesterday after the state passed one of the most restrictive voting bills in the country. And no Republicans on the committee participated in those proceedings, although they were invited. Now, Democrats, including Senator Amy Klobuchar, who is leading the committee, are pushing for a federal elections overhaul. Senator Raphael Warnock says Georgia became ground zero for the sweeping voter suppression efforts, gaining momentum all across the country.
What we did in Georgia this last election in terms of turnout should have been celebrated by everyone, regardless of political party. But instead it was attacked by craven politicians who were more committed to the maintenance of their own power than they are to the strengthening and maintaining of our democracy.
Now, Governor Brian Kemp did not attend the hearing, but he did hold a phone call as it came to a close, saying Democrats say their facts are wrong. The governor says critics need to read the law.
Encourage Senator Klobuchar, Ossoff, the other members of the committee, and a lot of the naysayers, including people in the national media, they should actually just read this bill.
Now, this is a lot of information, of course, and we've broken down the law, all 95 pages for you as well, highlighting everything that you need to know. You can find it inside the 11 Alive News app. Chesley, Rain.